So about a year and a half ago, I made a video showing the custom rear bike light that I built for one of my bikes, which is just mounted to the bottom of my milk crate down here. And so I've had it for a year and a half now, and I've been extremely happy with it. I find that it does, a really good job of making me visible to the cars that are coming up behind me. The only problem is, during the winter months, I ride two bikes. I ride this bike as well as this other bike. And this bike has, a conventional kind of a rear bike light on it, which, does a pretty good job. But I'd really love to have one that's more similar to this on my other bike too. So this is actually a project that I'm wanting to do for a really long time. But the main thing which has been holding me back is that when I built this project, I used this red plastic lens, which is actually a lens for a brake light on a car. And I was lucky enough to just find this one sitting on the side of the road, but the problem is I don't have a second one for building a replica of this for my other bike. Yesterday I saw these reflectors for sale, and I think if I put 3 of them side by side, I'll be able to use them as my lens for my rear light. These actually have kind of a sticky backing on them, but if you peel it off, then you're left with something that looks like this. So I'm thinking if I put my LEDs directly behind there, this will illuminate nicely and work really well for my rear light. So here I'm just cutting the strips of MDF, which is what I'm going to use for mounting my LEDs behind those reflectors. The MDF came from the backing part of a bedside table that someone was throwing out, so I managed to get it for free. Just had to cut it to size. As you can see, the MDF is cut to fit perfectly behind each of the 3 reflectors which are going to go on my light. Here I'm just measuring where we're going to drill the holes, which are where the LEDs are going to get mounted in. Each reflector is going to have 5 LEDs sitting behind it. Here I'm just center punching each of those holes using a pointy drywall screw as my center punch. I used a 3/16 drill bit to drill each of the holes. I found that 3/16 is a really good size for fitting in the typical 5mm LEDs that are used for these kind of lights. Now using a countersinking bit, I'm just putting a little bit of a countersink on each of the holes. That allows the LEDs to be pushed through so that they sit flush inside of the MDF. So I wanted one of the 2 sides of the MDF to be shiny and reflective so that it would reflect any of the diffused light coming off of the LEDs. I used aluminum foil tape to achieve this, sticking it on one of the 2 sides. It seemed to work pretty well. Here I'm just using a bolt and a hammer to punch out each of the holes which got covered up by the tape. And now inserting the LEDs into the MDF. It's a fairly snug fit, which is good because you don't want them to move around, but it's kind of hard to get in there. So I developed a homemade tool for doing it because I've done this many times before, but you should be able to use a pair of pliers instead if you don't have this. And there's what the finished assembly looks like. Now I'm cutting and stripping some copper wire, which is what I'm going to use to wire together all of the LEDs. Using a paperclip, I'm applying some flux to the connection surfaces, and using my soldering iron, I'm soldering those 2 surfaces together. Testing out my connections using 3 volts from 2 AA batteries. Now soldering together the other side. And now they all work together in parallel. After all the LEDs are soldered in place, the long ends from the leads can be clipped off. I wanted to use a piece of hardwood for the backing section of my light where the LEDs get embedded inside. I was lucky to find these 2 pieces of oak that were the exact right dimensions. They came from the same bedside table that I got for free where my MDF came from. The only problem was each piece had 4 holes in it. but I was able to fix that just by gluing some dowels in those holes, trimming the dowels off, and then sanding the surface flat with my power sander. After paint, you'll hardly know there was ever holes in that wood. With my handsaw and miter box, I'm trimming it to length. Cleaning up the cutting surface with my power sander. So this is sort of what it's going to look like when it's finished. Here I'm marking where I'm going to make the notches in the wood where the LEDs and MDF are going to go. I started by drilling a series of holes inside of the wood. I used my calipers to make sure that my holes have the right amount of depth in the wood. Now using a chisel, I clean up all of the wood which is in between each of the holes that I drilled. It's a fairly time-consuming process, but in the end I'm left with 3 rectangular cavities which are fairly neat and tidy, and the perfect size for my LED assemblies. Using a drill, I'm making some little marks on the reflectors to show where the LEDs are going to sit when they're sitting behind the reflectors. Using a Dremel tool, I'm making the back section of the reflector so that it's smooth in these areas. The reason I did this was because these reflectors were originally designed to go on the side of a moving vehicle. When I tried putting LEDs directly behind it, there wasn't very much light which got shone directly backwards. Most of it got refracted at about 45 degrees. By shaving off these textured sections, I effectively made the light much brighter when viewed from behind, which is the place that matters the most. The reflectors will get mounted to the backing part by some screws. So here I'm just drilling the holes for those screws and attaching them. The piece of wood originally came with a slot which ran the full length of it, so I just filled in the slot at the ends using a few scraps. Now I'm soldering some leads onto each of the LED assemblies to connect them together so I can try them as a whole. Originally I had each of the LED assemblies so that they could be powered individually, so that I could do some sort of an alternating flashing pattern between the different segments of the light. Later I decided to do away with that and I soldered them together so they operate as a whole. So here's my first look at what the lights look like when they're all turned on and when they're behind the reflectors. So far I'm really happy with how this project is turning out. The next thing I need to worry about is mounting the light onto the bike. So here I am drilling some holes and inserting some bolts into those holes. Now I'm just smoothing off the remainder of the varnish which was left on it, and smoothing over the front surface, particularly in the areas where I had filled in the slot. So I wanted to be able to bolt and unbolt the light from my bike without having to take out all of the LEDs to access the heads of the bolts. So what I did was I drilled out the ends of each of the holes, took my chisel and made those holes hexagonal, so that my bolt heads fit nicely in there so that I could permanently embed them in the wood. I started with a dab of glue in each of the holes, and then inserted my bolt inside, wiping off the excess glue that got on the threads. And then another dab of glue goes on top to fill in all of the crevices. And one final dab of glue covers over the head so that it won't make contact and short out the LED circuit. So now I'm cutting the pieces of steel, which I'm going to use for making brackets for holding the light onto my milk crate. Using a file, I'm smoothing off all of the rough edges. Measuring where I need to drill the holes. And center punching them with my drywall screw-in hammer. Lubricating the surface where I'm going to drill, and drilling my pilot hole. Now enlarging that hole to its final size. Cleaning off the burrs with my countersinking bit. Now bending a bracket is pretty easy when you've got a vise to put your piece of metal in, but my apartment doesn't have one, so I had to improvise a little bit with a clamp and a piece of metal on the side of my table. Overall, I was quite happy with the brackets I was able to make. So my angled brackets get bolted to the two outside bolts in my light. As you can see, these brackets have a very tight corner. For ease of assembly, I just trim the ends of the bolts shorter. There we go, much easier. So the brackets line up with holes which are in the milk crate, and the middle bolt gets bolted right to the rack. The bracket bolts stick through the top, and then this piece of strapping gets set on top of there for the nuts to push down on. Now we're just getting ready for paint. I think green's a good color for a green machine. By this point I had added a circuit board which made the light flash, and I was able to fit it inside of the light assembly. You'll also notice now there are only two wires which come out of the back of the light. To make it flash, all you've got to do is give it power. I used some kitchen and bathroom caulking to seal around the reflectors to make sure that no water would get in. I think the final product looks pretty neat and tidy. So now I'm beginning work on my battery assembly, and I'm starting by smoothing the ends of these caps so it'll make it easier for drilling holes in them. Finding the approximate center, drilling the pilot hole, and drilling the final hole size. This bolt is going to be used for making contact with the battery, so I wanted to make sure it was smooth and didn't have those little raised bumps on it. The bolt fits snugly in the hole that I drilled. On the other end, I'm going to have a bolt which has a spring which is pinched onto it. And that fits snugly in the other end. The batteries are going to sit inside this piece of underground sprinkler tubing. It happens to have the perfect diameter for AA batteries. I'm using this long bolt to measure how much I'm going to need to cut off for cutting it to length. I need to subtract the length of the compressed spring and the bolt. Here's where I need to make my cut. I'm using the miter box to help guide me, so I'll get approximately a perpendicular cut. Cleaning off the rough edges. Looks like I cut it in the right spot. To help me get a good glue joint, I sanded off the shiny outer surface of the PVC. I realized that there's a type of glue which is specifically made for gluing together PVC parts, but I had some leftover 2-part epoxy from another project, so I wanted to use that up instead. This bolt was a little bit longer than it needed to be. To mount the battery pack to the bike, I used a single zip tie to hold it in place, and then used some string to lash it to the rails of the rack. Now I'm bolting the light assembly to the bike, soldering on some ring terminals which will connect to the battery pack. This is the on-off switch that I'm going to use for controlling my light. It comes with 3 terminals, but I only need 2 of them, so I'm clipping off the other one to get it out of my way. Soldering on the leads, and bending down those tabs so that it can fit where I want it to go. Securing it in place with some hot melt glue. So now I'm all finished. I hope you enjoyed following along and watching me build my brand new custom rear bike light number 2. Please leave a comment and let me know what you thought, and thanks for watching.